35 years ago, a woman named Donna Lane Pritchard left her waitressing shift at the Pelican Cove Diner in Palmetto, Florida, walked to her car in the back lot at 11:40 at night, and was never seen again. Within 72 hours, Manatee County investigators believed they knew exactly who had taken her. They were right. They would spend the next 3.5 decades knowing it and being unable to prove it, watching the man they suspected move through this community with the same unhurried confidence he had always carried, attending the same church, sitting on the same bar stool at the same VFW hall, living 1 mile from where Donna Pritchard had worked the night she disappeared. Then, in the spring of 2024, a single piece of biological evidence that had spent 35 years in a refrigerated storage unit in Bradenton finally said what detectives had spent 35 years trying to prove. And the arrest of Gerald Ray Stoddard, a 71-year-old retired electrician who had been the first name written at the top of the original suspect list in 1989, shook this part of Florida in a way that people here are still processing. To understand why this case endured for so long and what it finally took to close it, you first have to go back to Palmetto in 1989. Because this is not a story about a cold case that went cold because no one was looking. This is a story about a case that stayed alive for 35 years because everyone involved, the detectives, the family, and ultimately the science, refused to let one man walk away clean. Palmetto in 1989 sat on the north bank of the Manatee River, directly across from Bradenton, a small working city of about 10,000 people where the fishing was good and the cost of living was low, and people tended to stay because leaving required a kind of momentum that daily life didn't always provide. The summers were brutal, the Gulf Coast humidity arriving in May and not lifting until October. The kind of heat that made the air shimmer off the asphalt and kept the ceiling fans running all night. By November, the snowbirds started arriving from Ohio and Michigan and filling the trailer parks along US 41, and the local diners filled up with people ordering pie and calling the waitresses honey and leaving decent tips because they were glad to be somewhere warm. Donna Pritchard had worked the dinner and late shift at the Pelican Cove Diner for 6 years. She was 31 years old and had a daughter named Kaylee who was 8, and a small rented house on 8th Street with a screen porch where she kept a hibiscus plant and a lawn chair and a jar of sweet tea in the refrigerator that was always there, always cold, for whoever walked through the door. She drove a 1984 Pontiac Sunbird with a cracked rear taillight she kept meaning to fix. She wore white sneakers at work because she'd tried the black ones, and her feet couldn't take a full shift in them. She saved her best tips in a coffee can above the stove, not for herself, she always said. For Kaylee's school clothes, for whatever Kaylee was going to need next. She had regulars at the diner who asked for her section specifically. One of them, a man named Gerald Stoddard, had been coming in since before Donna started working there. He sat at the counter, always the same stool. He ordered coffee and the daily special, and sometimes pie. He was 57 years old in 1989, a retired electrician who had come down from Georgia a decade earlier and settled into Palmetto with the easy permanence of a man who'd found the place where he intended to stay. He was known at the VFW Hall and at First Baptist and at the hardware store on 10th Street. He was not, by any measure that the world uses, a man who raised alarm. But Donna had told her friend and co-worker Charlene Bates, at least twice in the months before she disappeared, that Stoddard made her uncomfortable, that he watched her too long. That one night he'd followed her to her car, or she'd thought he had. She couldn't be sure, and she hadn't wanted to make a fuss about something she couldn't be sure of. She hadn't reported it. There was no policy to report to. There was no mechanism in 1989 for a waitress to file a complaint against a customer who watched her too long. Charlene would remember those conversations for the rest of her life. On the night of Saturday, November 11th, 1989, Donna Pritchard's shift ended at 11:15. She cashed out her tips, $42. Charlene remembered the amount exactly, and said goodnight to the kitchen crew. She put on her jacket. She told Charlene she'd see her Tuesday. She walked out the back door of the Pelican Cove Diner at 11:40 p.m. and was never seen again. Kaylee woke up on Sunday morning, and her mother wasn't home. She was 8 years old, and she waited until 10 o'clock, which was the longest she'd ever waited alone. And then she called her grandmother. Donna's mother, June Pritchard, arrived within 20 minutes. She called Donna's friends. She called the diner. By noon, she called the Manatee County Sheriff's Office, and 2 deputies arrived at the house on 8th Street and took down the information and told June to stay calm. Sometimes young women stayed out. They'd look into it. June told them her daughter had a child at home. She told them Donna had never once stayed out without calling. She told them to look for her car. The 1984 Pontiac Sunbird was found at 4:18 p.m. Sunday afternoon in the back lot of the Pelican Cove Diner, which did not open on Sundays. It was parked exactly where Donna had left it the night before, angled slightly toward the drainage ditch along the south fence. The driver's door was unlocked. Her purse was on the passenger seat. Her tip money, the $42, was still in the zipper pocket inside. She had not left voluntarily. Anyone looking at that purse knew she had not left voluntarily. The search of the river flats and surrounding Scrubland began Monday morning. Volunteers came from 2 counties. They searched in the heat for 4 days. On the 5th day, in a stand of sable palms off a dirt service road 3 miles south of the diner, Manatee County deputies located the remains of Donna Lane Pritchard. She had been there since Saturday night. The forensic evidence collected at the scene was substantial. A biological sample of sufficient quality was recovered and submitted to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Laboratory in Tallahassee. The technology to fully process it in 1989 was limited. What the lab returned was a preliminary finding, inconclusive for a definitive identification, but preserved, carefully, in conditions that the FDL maintained for exactly this reason. One other thing was recovered from the scene: a partial boot print in the soft ground near the tree line. Size 12. The tread pattern, investigators noted, matched a work boot brand popular among tradespeople and construction workers throughout the region. Detective Roy Harmon of the Manatee County Sheriff's Office was 43 years old when the Pritchard case landed on his desk. He had spent 14 years in law enforcement and had the particular bearing of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He was also, his colleagues would say later, a man who trusted his instincts more than procedure permitted, which would prove both his greatest strength and his most sustained frustration in the years ahead. Within 4 days of the discovery, Harmon had one name at the top of his list: Gerald Stoddard. Charlene Bates had told investigators about Donna's concerns within 24 hours of the disappearance. A second diner employee confirmed that Stoddard had been a regular on Saturday nights and had been in the diner the evening Donna disappeared. He'd paid his bill at 10:45, 30 minutes before her shift ended. A customer in the parking lot at approximately 11 p.m. reported seeing a dark-colored pickup truck idling near the back entrance. Stoddard drove a dark-colored pickup truck. He had, when measured as part of the canvas of known acquaintances, a size 12 boot. Harmon interviewed Stoddard on day 6. Stoddard was cooperative, articulate, and completely calm. He said he had left the diner at the usual time. He said he had driven home. He said he'd been in bed by midnight. He had no one to confirm this. He said he lived alone, which was true, and that he couldn't produce a witness for his movements after 10:45 because he hadn't known he was going to need one. He looked at Detective Harmon across the interview table and held eye contact for the entirety of both sessions. The boot print tread could not be exclusively linked to Stoddard's boots, too common a pattern, too many potential sources. The biological sample from the scene returned no usable match from the 1989 database. The pickup truck was examined voluntarily and yielded nothing that survived forensic scrutiny. Harmon had a suspect he was certain of, and evidence that proved nothing. Gerald Stoddard walked out of the Manatee County Sheriff's Office on day 8, returned to his house 1 mile from the diner, and did not leave Palmetto. He never left Palmetto. He did not behave like a man who believed he was in danger of being caught, and, in the early years at least, he wasn't wrong. By 1995, 6 years had passed. Kaylee Pritchard was 14, living with her grandmother June in the house on 8th Street. She had grown up knowing her mother's case was open, knowing the name of the man investigators suspected, knowing that knowing and proving were two entirely different things that the law treated as the same. She was a quiet teenager, serious in school, and she had a habit of walking past the Pelican Cove Diner on her way home, even though it was not on her route, because her grandmother had told her that the best way to remember someone was to move through the places they had been. Roy Harmon had never stopped working the Pritchard case, even after it was reassigned. He had requested it back twice. He had been denied twice on the grounds that fresh eyes were preferable. He maintained his own file, notes, photographs, cross-references, a log of every time Gerald Stoddard's name appeared in any law enforcement context in Manatee County, in a 3-ring binder he kept in his home office. Stoddard had, by the mid-90s, become so familiar a figure in Palmetto that people who had moved to town after 1989 had no reason to see him as anything other than what he appeared to be: a retired man of moderate means, consistent habits, and agreeable manner. He was at the VFW every Thursday. He brought a casserole to the church potluck every third Sunday. He fixed a neighbor's fence in the summer of 1996 and wouldn't take payment for it. Roy Harmon saw his name in a minor traffic citation in 1997. He noted it in the binder and said nothing to anyone. By 2003, June Pritchard's health had begun to fail. She had never recovered, not fully, from the loss of her daughter, the kind of grief that doesn't resolve, that simply becomes the weather you live in, and that eventually wears the body down. She died in 2007, at 74, without the answer she had spent 18 years asking for. Kaylee sat with her at the end and held her hand and did not say that it was going to be all right, because June had taught her that certain lies, however kind, were still lies. Kaylee was 26 years old when her grandmother died. She had been carrying the case for both of them for years already. She hadn't known it yet. But she was about to find out. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Donna. In 2018, Kaylee Pritchard, now 37 years old, working as a medical records administrator in Sarasota, the same age her mother had been when she died, submitted a formal victim family request to the Manatee County Sheriff's Office and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, asking that the biological evidence from her mother's case be evaluated for investigative genetic genealogy. She had researched the technique herself. She had contacted the Dina Doe Project. She had spoken with a forensic genealogist in Tampa who explained the process over a 2-hour phone call. She came to the sheriff's office with a written summary and 3 supporting documents. The cold case detective who received her, a woman named Detective Sergeant Iris Vega, read every page while Kaylee sat across from her. Detective Vega had been assigned to the Manatee County Cold Case Unit in 2015. She had read the Pritchard file in her first month. She had located Roy Harmon's 3-ring binder through a former colleague who had retired with Harmon and kept in touch. She had driven to Harmon's home in Sarasota. He was 78 by then, slower moving, sharper-eyed than ever, and sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours, going through the binder page by page. He had told her that in 31 years of law enforcement, Gerald Stoddard was the one he would take to his grave if he had to. She told him she didn't intend to let it come to that. The FDL laboratory confirmed in late 2019 that the biological sample from the 1989 scene had been preserved in sufficient condition to support a full genetic genealogy submission. The upgraded profile was uploaded to a public ancestry database in January 2021. The genealogical work took 11 months. The analyst, working in partnership with Detective Vega, traced the profile through a complex network of family lines concentrated in central Georgia and northern Florida before a branch narrowed, and narrowed again to a geographic cluster in Manatee County, Florida, to a man who had been living there since 1979. On a Tuesday morning in December 2021, Detective Vega obtained a biological sample from Gerald Stoddard through a method that required no confrontation, a discarded cup retrieved from a location he frequented. She submitted it to FDL on an expedited basis. 3 weeks later, the result came back. Full match. She called Roy Harmon before she called anyone else. He answered on the second ring, she told him. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that she thought the call had dropped. "I've been waiting 32 years to hear that," he said. On February 17, 2022, Manatee County Sheriff's deputies and FDL agents arrested Gerald Ray Stoddard at his home in Palmetto at 7 in the morning. He was in his front yard. He was watering a row of potted plants along the porch railing. He turned when the vehicles pulled in, and he stood very still, the garden hose running in his hand, the water pooling on the concrete around his feet. He was 71 years old. He had been the first name on the suspect list for 32 years. He had lived 1 mile from the diner where Donna Pritchard worked. He had sat on his bar stool at the VFW and eaten his pie at the counter and fixed his neighbor's fence and gone to church on Sundays. And none of it had made him anything other than what Roy Harmon had known he was on day 6 of the investigation in 1989. He was charged with first-degree murder. The reaction in Palmetto was not simple shock. It was something layered, the shock of the arrest overlaid on the longer, older shock of realizing that the community had, for 32 years, harbored a man that some people in it had never stopped suspecting. The people who remembered 1989. The people who had known Charlene Bates's story. The people who had wondered, quietly and without resolution, every time they saw him at the VFW or the potluck or the hardware store. They had been right to wonder. And no one quite knew what to do with having been right for that long. His trial was held in Bradenton in the fall of 2023. His defense challenged the genealogy evidence extensively, arguing questions of chain of custody and database reliability. The prosecution presented 34 years of investigative history, the matching biological profile, and the testimony of Roy Harmon, who sat in the witness chair at 81 years old, in a dark suit, and answered every question placed before him with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent 3 decades preparing for this exact conversation. Gerald Stoddard was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. He showed no visible reaction when the verdict was read. Kaylee Pritchard was 41 years old on the day of sentencing. She had been in the courtroom for every day of the trial. She had listened to the testimony, including Roy Harmon's, and when the retired detective walked past her on the way to the witness stand, she had reached out and briefly touched his arm, and he had nodded, and neither of them had said anything, and that was enough. In her victim impact statement, read before the court on sentencing day, Kaylee said that her mother had saved her tip money in a coffee can for things Kaylee was going to need. She said her mother had always thought ahead. She said she had tried to do the same, to think ahead, to not give up, to believe that the day would come when the right tools existed to say what everyone already knew. She said her grandmother June had died without this day. She said she had thought about that every day of the trial, and she intended to keep thinking about it, because forgetting it would be the same as letting go of June's hand all over again. She said her mother had told her once, when she was very small, that patience wasn't the same as waiting. That patience meant you kept working while you waited. That was, Kaylee said, the best description she had ever heard of what this case required of everyone who refused to let it close. Roy Harmon's 3-ring binder, 32 years of notes, photographs, cross-references, and a log of every time Gerald Stoddard's name appeared in any law enforcement context in Manatee County, was submitted to the Sheriff's Office archive following the conviction. It now serves as part of the training material for new cold case investigators in the Manatee County unit. Donna Lane Pritchard was 31 years old. She wore white sneakers because her feet couldn't take a full shift in the black ones. She saved $42 in tips on the last night of her life and didn't spend a cent of it because it was in the coffee can above the stove for Kaylee. For whatever Kaylee was going to need next. She had known something was wrong. She had said so to the person she trusted. And in the end, across 3.5 decades, the people who loved her and one detective who kept a binder in his home office made sure that knowing was never the last word. The science finally made it the first word of a verdict instead. What does it mean to you that investigators knew the suspect within days, but had to wait 35 years for the technology to catch up, and that it was the victim's own daughter who pushed to make that technology part of the case? And knowing that Gerald Stoddard sat in that diner on the night Donna Pritchard was killed, paid his bill, and then lived 1 mile away for the next 3 decades. What does that tell us about the kind of patience that evil is capable of, and the greater patience that justice requires? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Justice found Donna Pritchard after 35 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More stories are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.